Yeah, so my name is Don Hall. I've been part of something called the International Transition Towns movement for the past 15 years. It's a grassroots movement that started in the UK in 2006 and has since spread to over 1,000 communities in 50 countries around the world. I've served as education and outreach coordinator for a statewide hub, Transition Colorado, founder and executive director for a local transition initiative called Transition Sarasota in Florida. I was executive director of Transition US, the national hub for this movement, and I'm currently the training coordinator for the International Transition Network. And what we're trying to do is to cultivate more just, sustainable, and regenerative local communities. And based on all of this work, all of this experience, I wrote this book, The Regeneration Handbook. And happy to read you a few sections from the book today, and then take some questions. So we'll start at the very beginning with the introduction, first section, and it starts with a quote from Carl Sagan. "We humans appear on the cosmic calendar so recently that our recorded history occupies only the last few seconds of the last few minutes of December 31st. We are the legacy of 15 billion years of cosmic evolution." It's been updated since. "We have a choice. We can enhance life and come to know the universe that made us, or we can squander our 15 billion year heritage in meaningless self-destruction." We live in extraordinary times. We all know this on some level, but typically take it for granted as we go about our daily lives. As a result, far too many of us continue to merely cycle through our status quo routines as our world careens ever closer to disaster. However, if we can embrace our global predicament as the opportunity for unprecedented transformation it is, it can act as a catalyst for us to unlock our full potential and leave behind a legacy we can be proud of. According to the current scientific consensus, our universe emerged out of unfathomable mystery in the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. Dispersed particles gradually self-organized into atoms, which joined to make more complex molecules, which eventually coalesced into stars, planets, and galaxies. Earth itself formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago, and fossilized microbes have been found in hydrothermal ocean vents dating back 30.5 billion years, providing the earliest evidence of life. In comparison, the emergence of Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago could be considered an extremely recent phenomenon. For 97% of our history, humans have overwhelmingly lived in small, tight-knit communities, nomadically hunting and gathering in relative symbiosis with the earth. It's only been within the last 10,000 years since the agricultural revolution that we've increasingly settled in towns and cities apart from nature, enclosed and divided up the commons, and developed complex hierarchies to control surplus resources and labor. While this process of expansion based on the subjugation of nature and indigenous peoples has continued ever since, what we think of as modern civilization really only dates back about 260 years to the beginning of the fossil-fueled Industrial Revolution. At that time, global population stood at 600 million. There were no cars, planes, trucks, buses or trains, no telephones, radios, TVs or computers, no supermarkets or big box stores filled with cheap goods and produce from all over the world, no electricity, air conditioning, or curbside trash collection, no plastic bags or pharmaceuticals, no rock concerts, blockbuster movies, or professional sports, no health insurance, paid vacation, or retirement plans. Despite our current way of life having only existed for less than 0.1% of human history, we tend to think it's normal and assume it will continue indefinitely because it's all we've ever known. However, exponential growth in human population, consumption of natural resources, and greenhouse gas emissions over the past 2.5 centuries has already pushed our planet to the breaking point, ushering in what geologists have termed the Anthropocene epoch. Biologists have identified as a sixth mass extinction, and climatologists are warning is the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. For the first time ever, our entire planet is endangered because of forces human beings have unleashed. And many of us have already begun to experience the consequences of this in our own lives. More frequent and devastating natural disasters, the Great Recession, and the coronavirus pandemic, widening inequality and rising authoritarianism, and increasing levels of mental illness are just a few of the many manifestations of this rapidly unfolding environmental, social, and economic polycrisis. As bad as the past couple of decades have been, they have likely only served as a dress rehearsal for what is yet to come. Unless we start making big changes now, things will get worse. But our politicians are tragically failing us, and corporations have been allowed to continue their relentless pursuit of profit, mostly unabated. Even the heroic efforts of professional activists and grassroots movements haven't been nearly enough. In this context, it's entirely understandable that many people who care about the state of our world and genuinely want to help bring forth a more just and regenerative future feel hopeless, overwhelmed, and confused about how and where to start. We all find ourselves caught between a way of life that we know is rapidly coming to an end and a future that hasn't fully taken shape yet. However, it's precisely this moment when systems and certainties are starting to break apart at record rates that unprecedented opportunities for cultural and systemic transformation present themselves. When everything's going reasonably well, it's easier to simply float along with the mainstream, but we can no longer afford that luxury. Now is the time for all people of good conscience to lean into this challenge, step in off the sidelines, and begin to steer our own course. So that's how the book begins. After this introduction, I talk about this idea of evolutionary change, about a different kind of activism than most people are familiar with. Signing petitions, direct action, protest marches. But there's this other kind of activism that is based on creating alternatives to the status quo, about building the world that we want to see from the ground up, and about coming together as communities to do that. And this other kind of activism, where conventional political activism, the protest marches and the direct action, which is important, very important, perhaps more important now than ever. But there is this other kind of activism that is based more on natural and universal patterns of change than metaphors of a mechanistic paradigm. And so I talk about these patterns. And most central to this book and to this other way of change-making, I think, are patterns of transformation. I also talk about patterns of expansion, wholeness, and balance. But I think patterns of transformation are perhaps the most important. So I say patterns of transformation are the beating heart of evolutionary change. We can see this meta-pattern at work in nature in the turning of the seasons, as well as in cycles of life, death, and rebirth. While modern society tends to ignore and deny the inevitability of death in favor of fantasizing about immortality and eternal youth, this clearly isn't how life works. It's a harsh truth, but we can't be reborn without first going through a process of dying to our former selves, which can be extremely painful and disorienting. Nevertheless, this is the way life regenerates itself. Last season's crops need to be composted in the fall for the soil to burst forth in even greater abundance next spring. The caterpillar has to melt down into an unrecognizable goo before its imaginal cells can begin to resurrect it as a butterfly. Because this dying process can be terrifying, it's important to remember that greater life always awaits us on the other side. In many traditional cultures, elders were available to guide young people through this treacherous passage. However, in our modern world, authentic elders can be difficult to find. Because most have not gone through the process of transformation themselves, they're simply unable to help us. Well, one might reasonably assume that transformation looks like a line constantly angling upwards, or a circle that ends precisely where it began. I've come to believe that it's more accurately depicted as a U-shape. Unlike a line, transformation isn't straightforward. And unlike a circle, we don't end up in exactly the same place where we started. Instead, we are fundamentally changed in the process. This idea of transformation as a U-shape comes from Theory U, which was originally articulated by Peter Senge, Otto Scharmer, Joseph Jaworski, and Betty Sue Flowers in their 2005 book, Presence, an exploration of profound change in people, organizations, and society. Their introduction explains how this pattern emerged from a series of interviews Scharmer and Jaworski conducted with more than 150 leading scientists and entrepreneurs about the nature of innovation. In one of these conversations, Brian Arthur, a prominent economist and Taoist practitioner, described his creative process as consisting of three distinct stages: observe, 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 retreat and reflect, and act swiftly with a natural flow. In the years following the publication of Presence, Scharmer mapped out this basic model in greater detail, culminating in the release of Theory U, Leading from the Future as it Emerges in 2009. During that time, he also became a senior lecturer at the Sloan School of Management at MIT and founded the Presencing Institute, which is described as an action research platform at the intersection of science, consciousness, and profound social and organizational change. As it's currently understood, Theory U consists of 7 distinct stages. By suspending our habitual reactions, we can stop mindlessly repeating the patterns of the past and begin seeing and sensing in a more direct and unfiltered way. This eventually produces an internal shift that enables us to move into progressively more effective action through crystallizing, prototyping, and performing. Although I find Theory U to be a particularly useful map of transformation, there are many other models that are strikingly similar. One is the hero's journey described by Joseph Campbell in his classic text, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Comparing mythologies from a wide range of indigenous cultures and religious traditions around the world, he uncovered a common pattern, a departure from everyday reality, followed by a perilous initiation in the depths, followed by the hero's return to the ordinary world, bearing new insights and gifts. Because so many different patterns of transformation align so closely with each other, it's reasonable to conclude that they're all pointing towards the same universal truth. Throughout this book, you'll encounter this meta-pattern applied to inner transformation in the spiral of the work that reconnects, interpersonal transformation in the stages of group development, and collective transformation in the 5 stages of transition. So I think I'll stop there and say that, these patterns are indeed scattered throughout the pages of this book, reoccurring in different fractal form at all sorts of different levels and in different ways. And this is all very abstract, right? It definitely has very practical implications for how those of us who want to help bring about a better world, who want to make change in the world, engage in that work and sustain ourselves over time. But in this book, I focus on the Transition Towns movement as a living example of evolutionary change in these patterns in the world. And very briefly, I have an introduction to what transition is. And it starts with a quote from the Transition Network that's called The Cheerful Disclaimer. Just in case you are under the impression that transition is a process defined by people who have all the answers, you need to be aware of a key fact. We truly don't know if this will work. Transition is a social experiment on a massive scale. What we are convinced of is this: if we wait for governments, it'll be too little, too late. If we act just as individuals, it'll be too little. But if we act as communities, it might just be enough, just in time. When the founders of Transition Town Totnes began their effort to build local community resilience and wean their small town off of fossil fuels, they didn't expect to spark a global movement. However, because their approach proved so successful, it naturally spread. First to other cities and towns in England, then to the rest of the world. Because transition is so multifaceted, it can be difficult to summarize in just a few words. Perhaps its most concise definition comes from the International Transition Network, which describes it as a movement of communities coming together to reimagine and rebuild our world. While this one sentence encompasses many key aspects of the transition approach, it needs to be unpacked to be fully understood. Unlike most movements that tend to focus on a single issue, transition is exceptionally holistic. It seeks to address not only environmental concerns such as climate change and resource depletion, but also a wide range of social and economic issues. Similarly, it seeks to transform not only external systems of food, energy, economy, and governance, but also who we are as individuals and cultures. Because it's so holistic, there are many ways to get involved, and everyone's invited. Transition is primarily focused on creating change at the community level, not because individual and political transformation aren't important, but because so many other organizations and movements are already working on them. Acting locally is strategic because it's at a scale at which most people feel they can make a significant impact. Acting collectively is strategic because it magnifies our efforts and helps participants feel less alone. In terms of Joanna Macy's three-part framework, transition encourages a paradigm shift and supports holding actions that directly confront injustice, but is mostly concentrated on building alternative structures that embody the more just and regenerative world we want. Because of this positive and practical orientation, transition tends to be motivated more by hope and possibility than driven by fear and anger. Recognizing that we're all in this together, transition also tends to be more collaborative than oppositional. Local transition initiatives partner with a wide range of other organizations, and transition hubs network these initiatives regionally, nationally, and internationally. Ultimately, transition aims to foster a different way of life that works for everyone, not merely reform the status quo. All of this adds up to what's been called the transition movement's initial genius. While no one movement can hope to bring about all of the changes our world currently needs all by itself, I believe the transition movement is an important piece of the puzzle. If it didn't already exist, someone would need to invent it. So most of the rest of the book is diving deeply into the transition movement and the transition model. Identify 7 key ingredients of transition that are context, vision, inner transition, healthy groups, community engagement, practical projects, and being part of a larger movement. And there's one chapter dedicated to each of those ingredients, filled with all sorts of practices and tools and resources and stories and insights. I'd like to read just a short section from the chapter on vision, because this is a really key part of transition and something that I think is lacking greatly in today's world. Where are we going as a society? It's not quite clear. So I focus in the second section of the chapter of vision on a model created by permaculture co-founder David Holmgren called the 4 scenarios. They are techno-explosion, collapse, techno-stability, and energy descent. So starting with techno-explosion. In an earlier iteration of this model, Holmgren didn't disguise his scorn for this scenario, labeling it the techno-fantasy. Nevertheless, it continues to prove compelling for many. Popular sci-fi visions from the Jetsons to Star Trek have long promised better living through technology and greater adventure among the stars, in which we can leave our troubled lives and world behind. While appropriate technology will certainly play a role in the Great Transition, betting the future of human civilization on speculative breakthroughs like nuclear fusion or carbon capture and storage is a gamble I don't think we can afford to make. Even if they somehow happen, new technologies often create more problems than they solve. One example of this is the enthusiasm with which many people living in big cities in the early 20th century greeted the arrival of the private automobile. While cars did save them from the scourge of horse manure piling up in their streets, we now know that the internal combustion engine has created a different pollution problem, many orders of magnitude worse. This same specter of unintended consequences hangs over present-day technological fixes such as artificial intelligence and geoengineering, both of which are rapidly gaining popularity. Perhaps the epitome of the techno-fantasy is the billionaire's race to space. I'd love to ask Elon Musk specifically how he plans to colonize Mars down to the smallest detail. Even if he's able to muster the resources and technological wizardry to do so, wouldn't his efforts be better focused here on Earth? Compared with the dusty desolation of Mars, Earth is a veritable Garden of Eden. We already have a breathable atmosphere, soils that grow crops, forests and oceans, and millions of species of bacteria, fungi, plants and animals that have co-evolved over billions of years. Collapse. Many people in war-torn regions and failed states are already living through a form of collapse, and it isn't unthinkable that more may be joining them soon. The recent ubiquitous of apocalyptic novels, movies, and TV shows seems to me a sign that even people in relatively stable and wealthy countries are beginning to contemplate this possibility. There are some I know who welcome collapse as a way to wake people up and start over with a clean slate, but this is a very dangerous idea. We are nowhere near prepared for this. If modern civilization collapsed tomorrow, billions would likely suffer and die for lack of access to food, money, and health care. It would be an unprecedented disaster. Well, I agree we shouldn't waste much time and energy trying to prop up an outdated and exploitative system. We do need time to develop alternatives at scale. In a context where collapse is an increasing possibility, prepping by learning to grow one's own food and gathering essential supplies to weather an emergency is obviously prudent. However, building bunkers and stockpiling guns and ammo seems to me a distraction from the work of building resilient communities. I, for one, don't want to spend my precious time preparing to live underground on a ruined earth or training to kill my hungry neighbors. In a collapse scenario, we'll either thrive together or suffer apart. Techno-stability. If you look closely at Holmgren's diagram, you'll see that the lines for the techno-explosion and collapse scenarios actually run together at first, as do those for techno-stability and energy descent. This is intentional. The brief overlap between techno-explosion and collapse is meant to signify that continuing to push growth too far beyond its limits will result in a precipitous crash. The slightly longer overlap between techno-stability and energy descent suggests the possibility that these two scenarios may appear indistinguishable for a time, but will eventually diverge as more radical change becomes unavoidable. Techno-stability is essentially the belief that incremental reform of current systems is a sufficient response to our predicament. I remember watching An Inconvenient Truth when it first came out, and being shocked when, after an hour and a half of listening to Al Gore prophesy the end of the world, most of the solutions superimposed over the end credits were things like switching out your light bulbs, bringing reusable bags to the grocery store, and buying electric cars. Despite these suggestions being utterly inadequate to the crisis at hand, they're still the kinds of responses most often promoted by people in positions of power. While taking small steps towards sustainability by doing things like recycling and taking shorter showers is important, if that's all we do, it won't nearly be enough. If we believe we can keep consuming as much as we want, flying all over the world, as long as we purchase green products and carbon offsets, we won't fundamentally change the way we live. Similarly, if we think governments and corporations will solve all of our problems for us, we aren't likely to engage in collective action. To respond to our global predicament with the seriousness it requires, we need to move beyond techno-stability as well. Energy descent. It's not hard to see why this fourth and final scenario is almost entirely absent from mainstream political discourse. Mere mention of the possibility of dissent is considered heresy by those who still worship at the altar of endless expansion. Although I believe energy descent is our most realistic and hopeful option, it points in exactly the opposite direction from the path humanity as a whole has been pursuing. One common criticism of energy descent is that its proponents want to take us back to the Stone Age. However, this is an extreme misrepresentation. At least in the short term, energy descent will look a lot more like the first half of the 20th century here in the U.S. than hunting squirrels and living in caves. It's also important to recognize that compared to collapse, energy descent would be much more gradual and likely bottom out at a higher level. In his 2009 book, The Ecotechnic Future, John Michael Greer suggests 4 broad stages civilization might pass through over the next several centuries. The end of affluence, the age of scarcity industrialism, the age of salvage, and the coming of the ecotechnic age. Although Greer studiously avoids making specific predictions about what this ecotechnic age might look like, its name alone suggests the possibility that, even hundreds of years from now, we might be able to maintain some of what's best about modernity. So, yeah, that's a vision looking forward in the future, and this idea of energy descent, of doing more with less, to dramatically reduce our energy and resource consumption while increasing quality of life, is the vision, the scenario of the transition movement. And I believe, the most realistic scenario that we have going forward. But what is that going to look like is the question. And I have some snapshots here from different transition initiatives around the world, the kinds of things that they're doing. that might point to a future in which we can have some credible hope. So first, regional food hubs. Networks for the aggregation and distribution of local and regional produce were commonplace only a century ago, but many were dismantled during the process of economic globalization. One group that's been trying to bring theirs back is the Belgian Transition Initiative, Liège in Transition. In 2013, they helped establish Ceinture Alimentaire I don't know. CATL, the Liège Food Belt. Since then, CATL, cattle, has woven together a powerful network of 15 local food cooperatives, including several farms and grocery stores, organizations dedicated to preserving agricultural lands and sharing farm machinery, a bicycle delivery service, 2 bakeries, 2 wineries, and a brewery. Cattle supports them all by organizing events, creating educational resources, facilitating collaboration and resource sharing, and helping to raise millions of euros for startups and expansions. It has also established a partnership with the city of Liège to lease public lands to local growers, helped form a district-wide food policy council, and regularly consults with schools about sourcing locally. According to Cattle, which maps local producers on their website, all of this has led to a doubling of market gardeners in their area over the past decade, with much more still to come. Community-owned renewable energy companies. Many transition initiatives from Fujino, Japan to London, England have started their own community-owned renewable energy companies. These entities typically raise funds by offering shares to local investors, some of whom pitch in as little as a few $100s, then use those funds to purchase, install, and maintain solar photovoltaic arrays and wind turbines. The community as a whole benefits from the increased renewable energy production, and small local investors, instead of utility company executives and shareholders, reap the financial benefits. Although it's not the largest community-owned renewable energy company a transition initiative has established, Brixton Energy might just be my favorite. In partnership with Repowering London, they have so far installed 3 large solar arrays on public housing, specifically to lower the energy bills of their community's most economically challenged residents. The biggest might be Bath and West Community Energy, which has raised £22.5 million to date and implemented 34 community energy projects totaling 13.35 megawatts, enough to power 4,500 homes. Local currencies. Many transition initiatives have also started local complementary currencies. Because they can only be spent at local businesses, they keep wealth circulating locally instead of being sent back to corporate headquarters. Local currencies remind those who use them of the benefits of shopping locally and serve as powerful symbols of community pride. The Brixton Pound's colorful 10-pound note, which features hometown hero David Bowie as Aladdin Sane, has been celebrated around the world. At its peak in 2015, the Bristol Pound was the UK's largest local currency, with 800,000 pounds in circulation and 280 local businesses accepting it. That year, Rob Hopkins, the founder of the transition movement, wrote that it combines printed notes, an open source pay-by-text system, and integration with the local credit union. It's accepted as payment on city buses, and the city council pays part of its staff's salary in the currency. The mayor also takes his full salary in Bristol pounds. Residents could withdraw Bristol pounds from ATMs throughout the city and use them to pay their local taxes and energy bills. While the Bristol pound was officially retired in 2021, the team behind it is already working on their next iteration, Bristol Pay. 2 more examples. Community-based redevelopment. In Totnes, England, where the transition movement started, they've taken on bigger and bigger projects over the past 18 years. The biggest of all is probably Atmos Totnes. In 2012, Transition Town Totnes helped found the Totnes Community Development Totnes Community Development Society, TCDS, which signed an agreement in 2014 to redevelop a derelict 8.6-acre industrial site in the center of town. The following year, TCDS held 20 public consultation sessions to solicit community input, receiving more than 4,000 individual contributions. The resulting design included 62 affordable housing units, 37 retirement homes, a 58-bed eco-hotel, an arts and music venue, a health and wellness center, 76,000 square feet of workspace, and a local foods cafe, all owned by the community and powered by 100% renewable energy. Although this plan was approved by 86% of local voters in 2019, and TCDS secured enough funding to purchase the property, just as the deal was about to close, the owner sold the site behind their back to another buyer. Heartbroken, but unwilling to surrender, those who had worked on this project for many years formed the Atmos for Totnes campaign in 2021. They collected 750 objections to the new owner's development plan, leading to its rejection in 2023. While the outcome still remains uncertain, I'm betting on Atmos Totnes to win. When a community claims its power to dream and design its own future like this, it becomes a force of nature that's nearly impossible to stop. And one last one. Municipalities in transition. Transition initiatives also frequently partner with their local governments to great effect. In just a few years, the Municipalities in Transition Project collected 72 case studies of these kind of impactful collaborations from all over the world. While gaining political influence at state, national, and international levels tends to be much more difficult, it's not beyond the realm of possibility, especially if we work together as a movement. Ungersheim, France, which calls itself the world's first transition village, is an example of what can happen when a local government puts its full support behind this kind of effort. Inspired by watching the documentary film In Transition 1.0, Ungersheim's mayor, Jean-Claude Mensch, subsequently rallied his entire government around the idea of transition. In 2012, they published a 21-point plan and immediately started putting it into action. Since then, Ungersheim has become a fair trade town, banned pesticides and herbicides, campaigned to shut down a nearby nuclear power plant, launched a local currency called the radish, created an atlas of biodiversity, converted a former mining site into a nature preserve and park, and switched to 100% organic school meals. They've also built the largest solar farm in their region, which provides electricity for 10,000 residents, 5 times the village's entire population, and have made public lands and facilities available for an eco-village, a 20-acre organic farm, and 2 communal kitchens. So I think those examples show that ordinary people really can make a change. in their local communities, giving people back hope that change is possible, changing the story that that community tells itself about where it's going, what its future is. But even more when these communities link together in networks. Like I said, there are 1,000 transition initiatives in 50 countries, but the much larger movement of movements is several orders of magnitude above that. The American environmentalist Paul Hawkins said at a Pioneers Conference in 2007 that he estimated there were 130,000 different organizations working for social and environmental justice around the world. And subsequently he started a website called Wiser Earth, and then wiser.org, that cataloged 114,000 such groups. He called it the biggest movement the world has ever seen. But it flies underneath the radar, largely because there's no one single name for it. And there's no one single charismatic leader, which is as it should be. As closing here, I just want to read part of one more section, which is called How Life Could Win. In March of 2020, just as the coronavirus lockdowns were starting here in the U.S., Rob Hopkins published a new post to his blog called What Did Sisyphus Dream Of? In it, he retells the Greek myth of a man condemned to push a boulder uphill forever and connects it to how many activists feel about working for a better world. We push and push, only to have our hopes tumble back down to the bottom and be forced to begin again. However, as he did so brilliantly before with the story of peak oil, here Hopkins flips another well-known story on its head. Quote, how would it feel to be on the other side of the hill, doing the work we do in a context where gravity is our friend, in a context where policy making and finance and cultural norms are behind what we do, not in opposition to it? It would feel like a very different world where policy and funding come to be in the service of rapid transition, where culture and stories of what's normal rapidly change, where the social permission for flying and other high-carbon behaviors rapidly shift. From our position on the uphill side of the slope, it's hard to imagine it, but imagine it we must. Although we clearly haven't reached the other side yet, something eventually has to give. It's said that all revolutions seem impossible until they happen. From 9/11 to the Great Recession, to the election of Donald Trump, to the COVID-19 pandemic, major world events continue to confound our expectations. We are shocked when black swans appear on a lake, but black swans have always existed. I'm convinced that historic change will occur within my lifetime. But exactly how soon it will come and whether it will be positive or negative on the whole, I'm less certain. What we do in the coming years and decades will have a significant impact on its trajectory. As the great unraveling continues, the need for radical change will become more and more apparent, causing more and more people to seek out alternatives. At that point, the winds of change will be blowing at our backs. Our job as leaders is not primarily to create this wind, but to be ready to harness it when it comes. So, what are the most important actions we can take to steer humanity towards a regenerative future? As neoliberal economist Milton Friedman famously wrote, quote, when that crisis occurs, The actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. End quote. While I shudder to think what the late shock doctor would prescribe for our current predicament, he happens to be right in this one instance. In times of turmoil, which path is chosen depends on two main factors. I call them the two imperatives. 1. We need to make the regenerative vision universally known. To accomplish this, we must do everything in our power to familiarize as many people as possible, as soon as possible, with concepts like the limits to growth, energy descent, relocalization, permaculture, and transition towns. The more people have an accurate understanding of the root causes of the great unraveling and are aware of regenerative solutions, the less likely we will be to demonize and scapegoat each other when times get even tougher than they are now. At the moment, these ideas are mostly unknown beyond a relatively small subculture of activists and other cultural creatives, but they need to be front and center in every discussion about our collective future. People need to be having conversations about them at coffee shops, churches, workplaces, and kitchen tables. The mainstream media needs to spend a lot more time covering the regenerative communities movement, and politicians need to be pressed about their plans for the great transition on debate stages. Humanity always needs a guiding story, a better future to reach for. We can't help it. We tell ourselves stories to make sense of our lives and our world. They provide us with reference points and a sense of direction, offering us meaning and purpose. For the past century, humanity's dominant story has been the American dream of upward mobility and middle-class prosperity for everyone. 2.5 kids and a white picket fence. While this isn't necessarily a bad vision, it's always been a lie. It's fundamentally unsustainable and has always been built on the backs of someone else. Slaves, immigrants, women, the natural world, and future generations. Although it originated here in the U.S., the American dream has since been exported around the globe, both by persuasion and by force. Thomas Kuhn wrote that paradigm shifts occur when a previously established model is found to no longer adequately explain new realities. In that space of uncertainty, new theories can be proposed and experimented with. Those that fit best with the totality of our knowledge and most accurately predict the future are adopted, while those that don't are eventually cast aside. I believe Charles Darwin said something similar. 2. We need to develop successful practical alternatives to the status quo in as many places as possible. Because regeneration runs so counter to the logic of the industrial growth society, we not only need to develop alternatives to existing policies, but also prototype living examples of the future we want. Practical projects like those mentioned in Chapter 11 enable people to experience for themselves how abstract concepts like degrowth, mutual aid, and community resilience manifest in the real world and help them to trust that they're nothing to fear. We need to recognize how big an ask transition actually is. We're asking people to take all of their eggs out of the basket of the industrial growth society and place them in our basket. If you've kept all of your eggs in the basket of the industrial growth society your entire life without any of them breaking, You might be a little skeptical when a stranger walks up to you and says, "Why don't you take all your eggs out of that basket and put them in ours?" You might want to take a long, hard look at that basket first. Is it frayed or full of holes? Will my eggs end up splattered all over the pavement? To convince people that our basket is big and sturdy enough, we need to prove that our ideas can work. Not just a little in a few places, but a lot everywhere. We need to prove that regenerative solutions can put money in people's pockets, food on their tables, and roofs over their heads. We also need to prove that people will be happier living this way. However, if this movement of movements can start making changes for the better at scale, people will notice. In contrast to all the bad news we're bombarded with daily, something like this could really stand out. Eventually, we might even be able to show a clear contrast between communities who are actively transitioning and thriving as a result, and those that are failing because they're trying to hang on to the past. The sooner we commit to a path of evolutionary change and regeneration, the more time we'll have to rebuild community connections and put in place alternative systems. The more awareness we're able to raise, the more food we're able to grow, the more renewable energy we're able to bring online before things go completely sideways, the better off we'll be. This might end up making the difference between a just transition or a future controlled by the disaster capitalists. If we focus on fulfilling these two imperatives now, we'll all have a much better chance to shape our own destiny. So with that, I'd love to open it up for questions if you all have any questions.
I have a couple of comments.
Yes, please.
So there's a music professor at UVM who is doing a play every town, a free concert in every of the 251 towns in Vermont. And he used to fly across the country to give concerts and so on, and he's given up flying because it is so desperate and detrimental.
Yeah.
And so in every one of these, he drives an electric car, and in every one of the concerts, he makes this statement about not flying and why.
Mm-hmm.
And he tries to locate one or two musicians in that town to play with him, predetermined songs and so on. It's very powerful. We've been to 3 or 4 of them. And some people say, well, I'm not giving up flying. I want to see my grandchildren, so on and so forth. But, I mean, he's doing this over and over. I don't know how many years. It's a year and a half since we saw the first concert, maybe 2 years. Gee, time flies. Anyway, so that's a little Vermont, that's one tiny little, piece.
Yeah.
And presumably his students know about it. I mean,
The word spreads.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one little thing. And then the food hub, NOFA Vermont, the organic, they're working very hard. There's something called Farm to Plate. There's a whole lot of different initiatives. I don't know if they have an umbrella, but I get my information from NOFA. But they're working very hard.
Yeah.
And their goal seems really outlandish to me, so much so that I have no idea what it is. How much food, how much we can feed Vermont by whatever year, but it seems like an incredible, especially as we first have to do something about people's eating habits. I've written a little cookbook just on that premise, because I don't think you can take care of yourself if you don't know how to cook. Mm-hmm. And people don't know how to cook. And when they first started this, NOFA and the state started this talk about, it was about 20 years ago, regional, enhancing, how can we enhance the local farmers' incomes, how can, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so there were seminars around the state, and I went to the one in Franklin County, and everyone started, they were asked what stands in your way, taxes, availability of land, this, that, and the other, and I typed up, people don't know how to cook, so they're not going to be buying your, you know, there was a huge gasp. Because if you don't, the farmer's market,
Yeah.
there's now sort of an equal number of people who are just selling eggs, meat, vegetables, whatever, and the people who are selling prepared foods, baked goods, or whatever. And I wouldn't want to hazard a guess who's, well, I know the bread runs out by 11 o'clock every morning.
Yeah.
But, so, I mean, it's a, I mean,
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I think the most important thing is that we all do our part. You know, if there were 8 billion people doing their part, for one thing, we wouldn't be having the problems we're having, and yeah, two, I think we'd have a much happier and more vibrant world.
but we have to give people tools. People don't know how to cook.
Of course, yeah.
And they think, I mean, it's changing. No, I don't think it's changing. There is a segment who's now cooking more. I think the pandemic did do that for some people.
Yeah.
But how do you persuade people to give up orange juice? Well,
So
it's not growing in Vermont.
Well,
They're trucking it here. They're using a lot of stuff. When you're doing that, you should also be eating seasonally and locally,
right.
which means giving up a lot of foods that people are accustomed to.
I want to confirm what you're saying about the not cooking. My son went out to California to visit family and friends, and he was gone for about a week and a half, and he said, and he stayed with all these different people. Not once did he ever eat a home-cooked meal. All they did was order out
Take
or
it.
go out to eat.
Well, the reason so I'm old, right? I'm 80. And,
That's not old.
well, I hope not. I hope there's another X number ahead
It
of me.
is the new
and-
60s.
well, yeah, right, whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, because I grew up a long time ago, we had a computer. I had no idea how to do anything on it. And so my son, who was in college at the time, or just, would bring kids home for the weekend. And I found out later when I visited him, and he was in New York City at Columbia, the first thing they would ask me, well, what did she feed you? Because I was doing home-cooked meals. These kids' moms were lawyers and doctors, surgeons, judges,
Sure.
Yeah.
and they never had a home-cooked meal. So I thought, all right, no, I wanted to learn how to use a computer. My son said, do a project. And I thought, all right, a cookbook for these kids. Because you can't learn to cook from Joy of Cooking or any of the big, it's changed. And this is 1999. But it's changed now, but somewhat. So I wrote a very easy, basic sort of cookbook for that purpose, but it was really, the purpose was to learn how to use a computer. And do all that. And then
The cookbook was
I
just
fell into the
science.
trap of self-publishing. And
Yep.
because there's a trap out there.
So I read this book, and although Dawn read a lot of what was in there, there is so much more, so many important things, including our inner transition, how we learn to be healthy inside, to do this work, which helps us be positive.
Well, and I still believe cooking is the basis for all of that.
Food
Food
is
but
essential.
also
Real
cooking-
food, real
but, right,
food.
but cooking also gives you the opportunity to be creative. You're missing one ingredient. Oh, well, what can I substitute?
Right.
And through the years, I've listened to so many interviews or read interviews where the artist has said the first creative act I ever did was change a recipe. And so I really think that's part of the key of making yourself healthier mentally so that you can make these transitions. And you don't feel scared then by scarcity. I don't have that egg. What can I do instead, to put in that cake, Now the vegans have that one settled with flaxseed and water. Oh, is that a disgusting thing? You have to flavor it very well to get that one down.
But I think you said some of the communities are doing communal kitchens instead.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not cooking individually at all. You're
Well,
cooking
that's another
together
thing.
because
That's
you save
fun,
more
yeah.
that way.
Yeah, the communal kitchens are more about for small value-added businesses that are taking local produce and turning it into, pickles or
Pasta
pasta
sauce.
sauce or a
The
million
state runs the
things.
kitchen.
Well, yeah, it was in Fairfax, but
Yeah.
they moved it down to Hardwick. There's a wonderful, I don't know if it's a wonderful book, but the
Yeah.
title is
Hardwood,
The Town That Food Saved.
Yeah.
But they took our
The kitchen,
commercial
yeah.
kitchen out of Fairfax and
They
took
needed
it
more
down there.
space, I think.
Well, no, it just was empty because, well, we won't go
Well,
into
that-
the politics
that's irrelevant.
behind that one.
That's irrelevant.
What's the project that you personally were involved with that you liked or found most fulfilling or
Yeah.
most exciting? I'm sure you've been involved in some. So what actual thing did you find
Yeah,
most?
the one that first comes to mind is the first project we did is Transition Sarasota, which is still running today. It's called the Suncoast Gleaning Project, and we bring dozens of volunteers out to local farms to harvest whatever produce the farmer can't sell.
Yeah.
And donate it to local food banks to benefit the food insecure in our community. And it's such a win-win-win because the farmer gets a tax deduction for the produce that they donate. Those who depend on food assistance get a healthier option for eating. And all the volunteers get to go home with a bag of produce for themselves.
Yeah, we have that we have a program at Under NOFA, and somebody else. I don't know, but I don't know that we still do. We have had it, but
Well, back before the pandemic, they had a gleaning project.
Yes.
They went out into the fields,
Fields.
and then they took all the produce. Well, except for obviously what the volunteers got, it went down to UVM, and the chefs at UVM, because the kids were on, they did during school break. Fall break, and the chefs at UVM volunteered to cook it, and they made it into pies and applesauce and things, which they froze
Oh, cool.
and donated to the food banks.
Nice.
good.
So,
And it was kind of a whole
So
kind of community,
bring-
and then
yeah.
other people carried the stuff back and forth and got it to the thing.
Right,
It was
so-
kind of a whole large
Right.
group of people.
So it was
involved with that,
fairly
the same
large,
idea, yeah.
because I know,
But I
I
don't know what
don't
happened
know.
with the pandemic because so much of that stuff just.
But
Then-
that means it should be able to be brought back again if there's a blueprint someplace.
In Jericho, there's a transition initiative, and they have this program of one extra row. So the
Right,
farmer puts one extra row of beets and another extra row of, cabbage and whatever, and it's just for them, the transition initiative, to go and grab and give to food shelves.
We have Veggie Man.
Oh, yes, right?
We have Veggie Man.
Who's Veggie Man?
Well,
It's what a
Well, I
local
think it's- isn't
gentleman
it-
started it a number of years ago, and his farm garden was producing way more than they could use.
Huh.
And he started showing up in this superhero costume in
Oh,
front of the car.
nice.
Had
On a
free
big-
veggies. He'd put it on like social media and front porch forum or that. And he'd show up and hand out food until there wasn't any food left. And now somebody's taken it over,
Oh,
and
very cool.
they still
That's
have
good.
food, produce giveaways.
Yeah, we need to find creative and fun ways to do these
I think,
things. Catch people's attention.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I don't want to kind of
Sure.
slow things down
No.
here, or maybe I do. We have a long ways to go
Oh, sure.
back.
Yep. No, that's fine. Well, thank you for
Yeah,
coming.
thank you.
And thank you. Yay!
Yeah.